So this is our second night of a full week of presentations from photojournalists who have been covering the conflict, the war in Ukraine, and the rest of the week is going to be spectacular. But tonight we have Tim Fadek, who's a dear friend for many, many years. In fact, Tim, I found a photograph that you'd shot in Israel that you had given me a print of. And I think it's like 2000. That's when a black and white long print. Anyway, I digress. So I want to thank our sponsors: Archive Magazine, Photo Shelter, Pro Photo Daily, Epson Printing, and American Photography. So, Mr. Fadek, I give it to you. You're on.
Great. Let me share my screen so I can disappear from. So I don't have to. You don't have to see my face.
We'll still see you.
Unfortunately. I thank you for inviting me to this forum for the second, maybe third time. I don't even.
I think it's the third time too.
Third time, but I'm really happy to finally connect because the last few months have been crazy. But even now it's like a little crazy. I spent 10 days in London covering events related to the funeral of leading up to the funeral of the Queen. So I'm in London and it's after midnight. I'm really happy. I took a lot of amphetamines to stay awake, joking, of course. A lot of coffee. I wanted to present a very, very capsulized, specific feature photo essay about Ukraine instead of some of the more generalized photos that I made of war and destruction and death and things that have been leading up to everything that we've been seeing rather in the last 6 months. So I was on assignment for CNN, and this I want to break this up into like 3 parts, sort of like some background about the story itself, and how I did it. So if I can like talk about these 3 things, how I got into it, the story itself, and the people involved, and so on. Starting last year, I became acutely aware of the increased awareness and aggression and build up by the Russian forces, and I started going there, Ukraine, just to see what was happening. I went to the front lines, and this is before the second invasion, and I covered NATO troops trading Ukrainians. This was the beginning, and then, to be honest, what happened was I opened up the Washington Post app, and there was this blaring headline: 175,000 Russian troops amassed on three corners of Ukraine. And within days, I was on a plane knowing that the war was going to start. I mean, it was something that we've all been expecting. And now I want to say one last thing is that this is not really like the first invasion, it's the second invasion. So with that, CNN put me on assignment weeks, almost more than a month before the second invasion started. And I did a lot of feature stories, including the following that I'm going to show you. It's about a nurse. This woman, she's a Ukrainian nurse who has lived in this little village called Trotsbehenka. And I'm going to show you what it looks like. It's all the way in the east, in the Donbass region, and she works alone. She's the only healthcare provider for 5 villages. And what's interesting, for me at least, is when I was there, I was looking for a doctor initially, and I was thinking about basically finding a doctor who was visiting the frontline villages making house calls, but there are no doctors. And all the doctors sort of retreated back to the hospitals because it was too dangerous, essentially. And this woman and her husband, Vova, who you will meet in photos later, they remained. Now, just to give you an idea, and it's a little bit academic, so I apologize. I know you're all pretty aware of the war, and you have seen a million maps of Ukraine. But just to one more time, just sort of like give you an idea, that whole like red region, that's the new invasion. The purple is where Russia occupied in 2014. And in my little scribble, which I did in Photoshop, that gives you an indication where she lives. That little village, which was
Great that you did this, Tim. Really,
Yeah.
really great. It gives us
that little
gives us
little
context.
village. Thank you. That little village, Trolkspehenka, was before the second invasion of February 24th, was solidly in Ukraine. However, I shouldn't say solidly, and you'll see later, her house where she lives is literally meters away from the front line. They call it actually the frozen zone, or it's more like a line of control between separatists, and I say that in quotes, and the Russian forces in that region and Ukraine. Now, of course, because if you look at the map, she's living now in occupied territory. So the Russians now occupy her village and occupy that entire region. So this gives you an idea of like it's really a nothing village. I shouldn't say nothing. It's not a strategically important village. It's a village of just farmers. There's no military. There's nothing of strategic importance to the Russians.
And Tim, how did you meet her?
Well, when I was researching doctors, I contacted the Red Cross and I contacted local hospitals, and I was basically asking everyone, who do you have out there that are making house calls? Because I really wanted to see who was caring for the remaining residents, and the remaining residents of these areas in the Donbass region are mostly elderly, because the young people, because don't forget, the war really, in the minds of everyone, the war actually began in 2014. Between 2014 and now, the rest of the world thinks nothing happened, but actually the war has been going on for 8 years. And in those 8 years, all the young people left. They all went to Kiev, or they all left Ukraine altogether to find better jobs, find education. And who was left? The elderly. And I mean, in the ensuing 8 years, the stress of this war has taken an unimaginable health toll on those who stayed behind. The stress manifests itself in ways such as diabetes and heart problems, but there are no doctors. It's only her. I mean, there are other regions, and I'm sure there are other nurses, but I finally, after scouring the local media, the Ukrainian newspapers, I found a small article about this woman, and that she was like hanging out in this little clinic doing her work. And I thought, I have a name, her name, I have the name of the village. Let's just go and find her. And so I hired a guy. He's like, I want to call him a local producer. Then people will call him a fixer, and picked him up from his apartment. And we drove there 3 hours from the nearest village. the nearest city, Severodonetsk, and went to the town center, which consists of basically a church, a grocery store, and the clinic. She wasn't there because it was Sunday and the clinic was closed, but there was a phone number pasted to the front of the door in an emergency call, blah, blah, blah. And so we called her. Her name is Lilia Schwetz. And that's what I discovered, is this little clinic closed. So we called her and she answered and she was like, oh, I'm just down the road. And so we drove to her. I'm going to actually go back to these photos because they don't make any sense yet. I'll go back to them. And she said, yes, you can definitely hang out with me, follow me, and do your work for CNN. So I did. And she doesn't speak English. I don't speak Ukrainian, but my fixer, who was amazing, basically was my translator, interpreter, go-to guy. And patients would come in, very few, in the clinic, and explain to the patients what I was up to, and everything worked out really well. What I wanted to say was that the majority of the patients, even though I said earlier were elderly adults, the ones that came into the clinic were children, often for COVID-related or symptoms that were feared COVID-related. And I mean, she's using her iPhone to look into the eyes and the nose to evaluate. She doesn't have the proper medical tools.
And Tim,
yeah, go ahead.
This is occupied Russia, right?
Well, now it is.
And yeah,
at that time when I photographed it, it was not. It was Ukraine.
Okay.
Yeah.
Oh,
So, but the thing is, it's really interesting is that the clinic itself was so underfunded because actually the funding came from the major hospital in the occupied territory, the area of Luhansk region that was seized in 2014. So she's operating on like no money. No, in other words, maybe I can clarify. So up until that point, the major hospital that was like, this is basically an annex of a larger hospital in Luhansk. Luhansk, before 2014, was a normally functioning Ukrainian hospital system. And then the 2014 war began, and the separatists / Russians took control of Luhansk, thereby cutting off the administrative cutting off of funding and all of that. So she's basically, and her salary is $130 per month, far below Ukrainian standards. So I was going to say she gets calls, and I was there, mostly elderly people calling that they're not feeling well. And I have to admit, and she'll admit, it's a lot of elderly people who are calling just because they're lonely. They're not ill. They just want to, and they fake the illnesses. They're like, I'm feeling well, my back hurts, I can't breathe well. And then she arrives and there's nothing wrong with them, but they're just in need of human contact. And you'll see some of these people in a minute. So just to introduce her husband, Vova, Volodymyr. That's Vova is sort of a nice way of calling a Ukrainian man Volodymyr, which by the way is Vladimir in Russian. He's retired and he's 70 something. He used to be a truck driver, so he loves driving. And the two of them are the perfect little pair. They're totally in love. It's so sweet. She's 56 and he's like 69 or 70. I forgot exactly. He told me, but I forgot now. I didn't take notes. They met way back, like, 35 years ago. Uh, he was a driver. This is in Soviet times because Ukraine was part of the Soviet Union, and she was a nurse for a Soviet hospital, a military hospital. And he was a military driver, like a truck driver in the military. They met in the army, and they fell in love. And this is some of their early photos, right after getting married.
So Tim, for
Yeah.
her to show you these images, you've now gotten pretty close to her.
Well, yes, this actually happened after day 3 because um, she invited me and the fixer for dinner to her house, and after dinner we're drinking this homemade alcohol that her husband made. He also made homemade pickles, and we're having a good time. And I was like, because I always do this whenever I make a photo essay about people, like, do you have any photo albums that you might want to show me from like the older days, the earlier times? And she pulled out all these photo albums, and I was like, wow, this is amazing. Went through page after page. And then I was like, okay, tell me about this. Like, yeah, we met Soviet times. And that's really interesting because even though they're both Ukrainian, they're solidly Ukrainian. I mean, they identify as being Ukrainian. But, and it's a big but, like most people in the eastern part of Ukraine, they speak Russian as their primary language. And actually they have no ill will toward Russia or the former Soviet Union, because they're of an age where that's all they knew growing up. The Soviet Union provided for everyone. And then, in 1989, with the breakup of the Soviet Union, and they found themselves on the Ukrainian side of a liberated Ukraine, and they were like, wow, this is interesting. But they're not pro-Russian, but they have nothing against Russia, except when Russia invaded. Then there's like, whoa, this is weird. And this is why they were very open with me and showing me all these photos. They're like, there's nothing wrong with Russia when Russia wasn't aggressive. So
do you think, Tim, there's a piece of them showing you the photographs is similar to her getting these phone calls just to go see patients, and the patient just want to talk to somebody? Do you think there's any similarities to her, showing you the books and all of that, needing to show it to other people and have communication as well?
I think if I want to, let's go back quickly. I think she was really welcoming to me, in part because she gets so few visitors and there's so few outsiders. There was only, like I said, only one other journalist that came to visit her like months earlier. There's like, everyone in her social circle are like, other healthcare. So in her clinic, there's a secretary and another woman who's not a nurse, and the doctor only visits once a month, and then everyone else is in their 70s and 80s. So I show up, and like finally she has someone to talk to. I mean, on a non-journalistic level. Once we were done with the photos and she invited me back to her house with her husband to have dinner, we talked about everything else except her job and the politics. It was more about, she told me different things, how, she's only earning $130 a month, but she makes up for it by growing and selling potatoes and onions, and, showing me these photos from her youth. She told me about how she was in sports and, all these other things, how, even she would joke how before she met Vova, her husband, all the guys loved her because she was a real blonde and everyone else was like a fake blonde. I found that really funny, and he was laughing. But Vova, the husband, was like, yeah, that's what she tells everyone. But she opened up to me because I felt like she had never really seen or had outsiders before. in many years. And this, so, you know, she invited me to go on these house calls with her husband, and so I jumped into the back of the little Lada Niva, Lada being the typical Russian car, tiny, not really an ambulance, even though it looks like an ambulance. It was just a function of, anyway, he would be the driver, and we would go around, and it might take half an hour or an hour to get to the next village. And during that time, she and I would chat. Vova, by the way, who's lovely, her husband, not very talkative. Anyway, I would go in, she would like open the door, ask in advance, can we bring a photographer in? And in every case, they would say yes. So she would prepare. She already knew what she was dealing with. It might have been diabetes or some other illness, and she had her medicine ready. And she would get ready for treating the elderly. And here's one woman, I don't remember her name. I might have notes somewhere. But she was just really lonely, and she had nothing, there was nothing wrong with this woman. She just wanted, she made a fake phone call to the nurse, to Lilia, and she shows up and it's like, what's wrong with you? I have nothing, I just wanted to say hello. So there's quite a lot of that, actually. That's an, and then she took off her yeah, she took off her thing, did the blood pressure just in case, but ultimately there was nothing wrong with her. And that actually was weirdly, I mean, I was expecting a story where a woman, a nurse, is like treating, you know, severe health problems, but in fact she was more like a social services therapist. Great example. This woman, again, nothing wrong with her. She's I mean, you don't really know what's wrong with her, but she just came to the hospital to say hello, and she does it every day because she has no one else. And so I asked Lilia, the nurse, like, where are the children who are taking care of the parents? Like, oh, they all left. I don't know. I don't want to editorialize, but I don't know why the elderly were left behind.
Well, you know, from a couple of other segments that we've done, a lot of the photographers were saying that the elderly would not leave. They didn't want to leave, and that was a problem because, you know, everyone was running for their lives. But
well, yeah, that because they're comfortable where they live.
Yeah.
They're comfortable in their environment, and you know, where are they going to go? Live in some tiny cramped apartment in Kiev?
right,
No.
travel, yeah. They'd much rather stay in their homes, right? And
Yeah.
So is the winter starting or the winter ending?
Well, right here, this is photographed in February.
Okay.
So the winter is ending. It's February 8th. I photographed the beginning of the story is February 8th, 9th, and 10th. And then war began the 24th. It's 2 weeks before the war. The snow is melting, as you can see.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, I had like a little mini 4x4 car getting around, and there was one day, the normal route that I was taking, and I was doing the driving. I just used a combination of, you know, Google and GPS, Google Maps, and the know-how of my fixer, and we got stuck, or I got stuck in like a mud trap because the snow we were driving before started just completely melted, and I got stuck for like half an hour. It was like back and forth and back and forth, and it was the whole region is like so backwards in terms of infrastructure that I mean there's no internet, there are no public phone lines. There's one supermarket, there's one market, there's one bus that appears once a week. The bus to Severodonetsk runs once a week, and it's 2 hours away. The doctor, who might appear once every 2 weeks, sometimes decides not to show up. There used to be a dentist, but that dentist hasn't appeared. There was a gynecologist for a while. There was a pediatric doctor. All of these doctors, they all disappeared over the years.
And
Yeah, go ahead.
anything, yeah, no, I mean, so COVID is happening there as well at this time, right?
Right.
Right. I mean, it's an interesting thing, and because if for anyone who doesn't know, Tim presented a while back covering COVID in New York, which was one of the most incredible presentations I've ever seen on projections. So similarities to you emotionally, that piece, did that play into anything while you were shooting this, Tim?
There was, I'm not sure if I can make a comparison to that. I mean, with COVID was very different. It was like a medical emergency. Here we have a medical emergency based on lack of resources, whereas COVID is a emergency partly because of an overwhelming of the current resources. And this is again a nurse who is overwhelmed because she's basically caring for 1,400 people who are in these 4 or 5 villages surrounding Trokhtehenka. She reminds me a lot, and this is actually something that I was thinking about. There was a photo essay by Eugene Smith back in the 50s called Country Doctor. Eugene Smith was a Life magazine contract photographer, and he did a story about this doctor who was all alone, just went around photographing everything from injuries related to farming and so on. And I knew about this story, and I thought about it, and I was like, I want to find the country doctor, and so she was like, great. And I told her about this. I actually said, I'm looking for this country doctor story that was done in the 50s by Eugene Smith. She's like, well, that's great, but there is no doctor. I'm the country nurse. And yeah, and when there are real medical emergencies and her patients need to be placed into a hospital, well, it becomes a huge problem because it takes nearly 2 hours for the ambulance to reach her, and then another 2 hours to go back. If it's a real emergency, 4 hours in an ambulance may not be enough. So this is her staff. They're both basically administrative. We're about the same age, and it's interesting because she and I mean, she was born like a few months before me, but we got along, I think, because we're roughly the same age. There was something about she accepted me as like a brother or something. It was instantaneous. I mean, we don't even speak the same language, although I did use Google Translate whenever my my fixer was constantly using the bathroom, which I didn't understand that. He was gone half the time, so I was left alone with her a lot. And anyway, this gentleman actually did have a problem. He had fainted So this is not one of those cases where he called for a fake reason. He was not feeling very well. And I don't know, maybe if you look very carefully at the surroundings of his kitchen, he's not really taking care of himself. He's not washing his dishes and things like that. And that's very typical of what I've seen in this village. Elderly people are having a really difficult time keeping their lives together.
All right, so Tim, you're covering this story, and how are you getting information on whether they're going to invade or not? You know, how is that playing into what you're doing?
Okay, well, that's a slightly different part of the story.
Okay.
She's acutely aware. So her where she lives, her actual house plus her clinic is, well, her house is on the border of the front line before the second invasion began. Her clinic is also within a kilometer or so of that as well. The importance of her job is because she's dealing with, you know, over 1,000 people who are suffering from the constant stress of 8 years of shelling. So everyone thinks that the war was frozen, but actually her house and her neighbors' houses and all of these villagers, they've had shells landing and destroying their property over the last 8 years. She showed me photos of her house before it was partly destroyed, the outhouse and the backyard and the part of the roof of her main house was destroyed from shelling in 2015 and then again in 2018, because there's a constant, even before the 2022 February in second invasion began, there's been regular back and forth of artillery and mortar fire. So that village that she's in is just in the middle of the fight. And I mean, how can I elaborate? They've never felt that the war, they've never felt that the war left them, or that they've always been in a war, you know. And then when the Russians made the second invasion, it was like, oh, more of the same stuff.
Hmm.
You know what I mean?
So their lives didn't change all that much.
No, it didn't change very much. I mean, I was going in and saying, so when are you expecting the Russians to invade? She's like, the Russians are already here. They're already antagonizing us.
Okay.
Yeah. She invited us into her house, and I was able to, this is when I was able to talk to her a little bit more. You know, the thing about, you know, about her, it's a little bit, I wouldn't call it controversial, but because she and everyone speaks Russian, and they initially, for a long time, never really had anything against the Russians. So I've been on the phone with her. I mean, we're texting, and I've been in touch with her 4 times in the last 6 months just to find out how you doing, what's going on with you in Vova. I wrote to her briefly 2 weeks ago. I was like, you know, are you okay? She said, yeah, we're fine. We're still working. Everything's fine. The Russians are treating us well. And a lot of it has to do with the fact that her main language is Russian, and that she doesn't have real antagonism toward Russia. She doesn't want them around. She wants the Russians out. I can find that text actually. Like, are you happy with them? It's like, no, I want them to be out of Ukraine. You know, when Lilia and her husband Vova moved to this little village, that was like more than 20 years ago. This village was actually a getaway town. They're from Luhansk, and they, like many people, they would buy property, little villages in Trotpahenka and all these like farming towns. You've heard of the word dacha. So I mean, a dacha is basically a tiny house where you can get away for the weekend. But then in her village, they also have larger houses where she lives, and she had bought a larger house so that, you know, she and her husband could make these regular trips back and forth. And then as they got older, they were like, you know what, the big city life of Luhansk is not for us. Let's retire here. So they retired in this house.
No kids.
No kids. They have no children. No. But a lot of the people who live in Trotpahenka and the surrounding villages are the same way. It's basically a lovely getaway from the big city, and now they find themselves stuck. So to give you an example of how stuck they are, she has two sisters who are still in Luhansk, and she hasn't spoken to them in years. They're, you know, I mean, no, sorry, she hasn't seen them in years. She speaks all the time on the phone and texting them, but because of not just the war now, but before, there's no easy way to go back and forth across the border. And you know, so she's basically stuck there. And this is a view. Oh, and so, I mean, this is the view from her house of the front line before the war. Like literally beyond the third barricade would be the no man's land, and then comes the Russians. And you can actually see from her backyard, and she forbade me from making photos because Russian snipers would see me from the window. You can see the Russian position from our window.
So that would be that ridge in the back there, Tim?
Way back. Yes.
Right.
Way back. This is the only thing that I could photograph without being spotted by Russian snipers. But her house is to the right of this photograph. So I want to just quickly go back because it's kind of interesting. And it's my poor editing. So I mentioned earlier that in the clinic, there used to be a full-time dentist, full-time pediatrician, and a full-time gynecologist. There were 4 doctors working in this clinic, more like a hospital, but a small hospital. Of course, they're all gone, and all of the equipment has not been used in 8 years. And so this is the dentist's office. She calls it the torture machine. And then the gynecologist's office now just holds a bunch of flowers, dying plants.
That equipment has to be 60 years old, 70 years old. I mean, how old do you think that is, Tim?
Very old. Yeah. At least going back to the 80s. Yeah.
Wow.
But I think that, despite, all the difficulties, it's kind of inspiring to see one woman who has, perhaps she could have, picked up and left with her husband and moved to somewhere else, maybe in a less volatile area of Ukraine. But I asked her, like, why don't you just go to, Severodonetsk, or go to Kiev? And she's like, no, I'm too old for that. And basically, even though she's only 56, I mean, she felt like she was too old to start a new life and pick up and sell her house. Oh, yes, that's right. she's like, what am I going to get for this house? Nothing. She knows that her house is worthless, so she would have no place to live.
Hmm.
Yeah. And well, that's basically it. I wanted to just give you a glimpse of one person trying to make a difference.
Beautiful. So are you going to go back, Tim? Like, what do you think?
Well, I would love to. I'd like to go back with an assignment because the expense of being there is a little bit prohibitive. But yes, I feel committed to the Ukraine story because it's not just Ukraine; it's something world-shattering. I realize the significance of it, but I'll go back eventually. I just have to give an assignment. I actually did go back. I returned in May, and out of that time when I was there, I did get a small assignment with an American publication. But right now, the interest is waning, and so yeah, it's not so easy. It's better to be Ukrainian and being based there, I would say, rather than parachuting in.
Right.
You know,
And
it seems like this is a huge step back in time, and that historically these little shtetls, which is the term that I would understand, are like 20, 30 years behind where the rest of the world is what it feels like from what you're sharing with us.
Yeah.
Yeah.
and has this town been bombed? I mean,
Yes.
Oh, it has.
Yeah, I mean, over the course of the 8 years before the current invasion, it's regularly seen, back and forth, Ukrainian, Russian bombings, and artillery and mortar fire. Yeah, it's she took me on a little tour for like one afternoon, showing me all the houses that were abandoned, that were destroyed. And I wasn't in the 3 days that I was there. I mean, it's a very short time. Of course, I didn't hear any. There was nothing going on, but it does happen. I asked her how often, and it would happen like once a week, where there's some kind of explosions that are happening somewhere, and we're talking about small villages that are being like hit, and the again the level of stress that is being taken on by the residents is resulting into these, well, according to her, mostly like diabetes and alcoholism are biggest problems. And she's always replenishing people's insulin prescriptions, and
Yeah, I mean,
yeah.
that's a good question. How does she get medical supplies? I mean,
Right.
John.
Good question. So now, even though the clinic used to be part of Luhansk, which I'm going to go back very, very quickly. So Luhansk was east of her. Now she was getting, I wish I could blow this up. I'm not sure how to do it. Basically, there's another town, another city called Severodonetsk. They're not the administrative center for her village. However, they were providing her with medical equipment, but limited, really, really limited, because Ukraine in general has a terrible, and I know firsthand because I went to a hospital. I went to two actually for a rabies vaccine. That's another story. I'll tell you later. The medical facilities are terrible, and what they offer is, yeah, it's Europe, but it's Europe at the lowest level. And what they can barely offer her is bare bones. It's really
And Tim, when you say terrible, meaning what? Like, just no supplies and,
It's really backwards. I mean, I was in Kiev, the capital, and I had, okay, so I've been to Severodonetsk Hospital, and I've also been to Kiev hospitals. They are something out of like the 1960s with, I hate to say it, but there's the level of sophistication is not normal. It's not normal for Europe. It's not normal for the way the medical professionals are dressed. They're not wearing gloves. They're, yeah. When I got bitten by a dog in Irpin, which is the city, or the smaller town north of Kiev, I had to get a series of 4 vaccines because I had never gotten the vaccine before. So I went to the Brovary Hospital, and yeah, big hospital, lots of people, lots of doctors, and they handed me the vaccine vial to warm it up, and the idea of them like putting alcohol in my arm it was like non-existent. They like took some water out of a pail and they just washed my arm. I was like, whoa, wait a second. I think you need to use alcohol for this. I just felt like I was living in a different world, and she is definitely living in a different world.
so when you decide to go back, what are you compelled to go see her? What is the bond now between you two?
Well, what I would love to do, I need to figure out something where, do you remember during COVID, and this came from a suggestion of a friend of mine, a photographer. Do you remember, and this is actually a really great idea, I don't know how to get it off the ground. During COVID, there were a lot of photographers who were figuring out how to use an app that controls another person's iPhone or computer, like remotely, so that you can direct them to make portraits or video or whatever from a remote position. Because with COVID, there were photographers making like photo essays or photo shoots, and they were in a different city or a different country. I thought, yeah, look, well, it was not my idea. But it was like, wow, this is a really good idea. Maybe I can figure out some way of directing Lilia, the nurse, to position her phone in a way that I could actually see what's going on. Do a photo, have her be the photographer, but I would direct her. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Rather than, but it would have to be done real time. There's an app apparently, and I am like the worst person when it comes to technology. But to remotely direct her to photograph her current living situation and work situation, I think that would be amazing, actually. Like the nurse under occupation, because I can't get there. I would love to be there. I would love to be there with her in occupied Ukraine, but I'm not going to risk that. I can't get in.
Right. So I mean, it would be sort of FaceTiming with her, and then she turns the camera around, and then you say, "Yeah, take a shot there." That's an interesting.
Yeah, I mean that's what people were doing, but it resulted. I know from talking to people, it results in really low res imagery. However, there is a higher res option available apparently, so which basically takes over the camera of the person who you're asking to work for you.
Right. I mean, so now the next time you go, you bring an extra camera, right, an extra phone, yeah, and say I'll be contacting you and use this phone, right? I mean, something like that. That's an interesting idea.
And she's pretty savvy, so she would actually be the perfect person to do that. And her husband is very cool, so maybe he would even help her with that.
Yeah, that's Yeah, so I wonder, so what does the credit line read on that, Tim?
What do you mean? Oh, right. You're asking about that. Well, clearly, it would have to be a co-credit because, I'm the director and she's the photographer. But again, there is that app where apparently the if you want to get really into it, the shutter press would be done by me.
Oh, so
Oh,
that's how that app works. Okay.
apparently, again, I'm so behind the 8 ball on this.
But there was also that story of I forget the photographer's name, but he was in the jungle and the monkey grabbed the camera and was clicking, and there was a whole controversy who took the photograph, on and on and on. Yeah, that's a story for another time. Anyone else have any questions? It's really nice, Tim, to get a story like this of seeing the heroic duty of the human the human condition, right? To just keep on going on, right? Not giving up and doing what you can do. I mean, it's typical from what we've seen of the Ukrainian population. They just press on.
Oh, there's also one thing I maybe kind of important thing I completely forgotten about. So when she was younger in 1983, during Chernobyl, she was actually one of the nurses sent to Chernobyl.
Oh, is that right? Wow.
Yes, to take care of the sick who were irradiated.
So there's a real story behind this woman. Yeah, that's yeah. If you go back or whenever this godforsaken war stops, do you feel compelled to go see her?
Absolutely. And it's really easy to get to her. Like it just takes time. I know how to get to her. I know where she is. So basically, last year, because I was spending so much time before the second invasion, before the war, as we call it, actually happened, I spent so much time last year in a town called Kramatorsk. Kramatorsk is a great sort of jumping off point for everything that you want to cover in this Donbass region. Right now, of course, it's completely bare bones. There's very little going on, but it has all the markets and the hotels, and it has the reason why it was attacked is because it has the military airport. But the great thing is that you can jump off to anywhere, and I can get to her in 3 hours. So yes, if things normalize, guaranteed I'm going to go back and see her.
Okay.
Yeah.
I guess is any more insight into the Russian-Ukrainian space for her? Like they were okay with Russia being there, and now they're not. I mean, would like these her two colleagues there, would they take up arms? I mean, would they be doing volunteering, for the Ukrainian army? Would they be neutral? Any sense of that?
If she was to choose, she would be Ukrainian. She would, if somebody handed her a gun, she would fight for Ukraine. The thing is that everyone in that region, we're talking about, like millions of people, they're solidly Ukrainian, but they all speak Russian. But it means nothing because, basically everyone in Ukraine speaks Russian. It's a question of what is their first language. The further west you go toward Poland, from Kiev to Poland, everyone speaks Ukrainian as a first language. Language is very, very important when it comes to national identity and allegiances. However, even though in the eastern part of Ukraine where she lives, They all speak Russian. It doesn't mean that they're pro-Russian. She, as I said in the very beginning, that she has nothing against the, the old Soviet times, and she actually has a slightly, nostalgic view of what life was like under, in the Soviet times, because she grew up. She's old, she's like 56, she was a teenager, working as a nurse, 18, and it was like a Soviet nurse. So back then, it's all she knew. And there's countless people who are like her, and they're not anti-Russia, but they are anti-Russian invasion or anti-Russian aggression. And they are clearly Ukrainian, their like national identity and ethnicity is Ukrainian, even though they speak Russian. But if you gave her a gun, she would fight for Ukraine. No question.
So here's a good question from Allison. With snipers around, how safe is it for you to be out and about photographing?
Good question. And her husband, Vova, kept me safe on that level, because this is why I was not, when I was in her kitchen or in their kitchen, and I raised my camera to photograph the Russian position outside her window, her husband ran over to me and he's like, "What are you doing?" And he grabbed my camera and he like threw it down. He's like, because they can see everything. So it's not safe, obviously, but if the Russian snipers see anything that might be military, whether it's binoculars or a lens or something, they could easily shoot into her kitchen. That's how precarious it was. So nothing happened, thankfully. Yeah.
Yeah. So when you're walking around, do you have your like your press credentials and your vest on, as press?
No, not when I'm in these civilian areas and hanging out there. No, because during this time in this particular region, it wasn't really a hot zone. But when I'm with, and I was not anywhere near, and I avoided all contact with like also Ukrainian soldiers. But if I'm on the front line in the trenches, with the Ukrainian, then Ukrainian soldiers, I mean, I am duty bound to have Kevlar vest with plates and a helmet.
One thing I noticed, and tell me if I'm wrong, but from all the images, I don't see, unless I've missed it, a Ukrainian flag or a Russian flag in any of the homes or the clinic. Is there any significance around that?
Yeah, there's nothing. I'm going to go back to the let me find that. Where is it? If I can find, yeah. The only time I saw the colors of the Ukrainian colors is here.
Right.
This is this statue is Konrad Bulati. He's a Cossack, actually from the 1800s, who my knowledge of Ukrainian history is poor, but he led a counterattack against invading Russians back in 1850 something. That's the thing. If you're an expert of Russian history, they've been constantly antagonizing this region. And so this is a guy, a Cossack, Konrati, who successfully defended this area from a Russian invasion 180 plus years ago. So they put a statue for him. And here you have the colors. So there's that. But these are the only colors I saw.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, So you think that has to do with the proximity to the border?
Yep.
Right?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, again, it's like you, you talk to if you talk to historians and they understand and they can explain to you better than I can the geopolitical situation that Ukraine for the Russians is like the mother, the birth of Russia comes from Ukraine. And so it's kind of like, there's a couple of examples in world history, but nothing that I can see is so significant. I mean, Ukraine is so unique in that it is Russia. It's like the birthplace of Russia, the birthplace of the Russian idea. And that's why it's so important for Putin and for so many Russians to, assimilate Ukraine back into Russia. They even call Kievan Rus. Kiev was considered the birthplace of Russia.
Oh,
They call it the Kievan Rus.
Yeah. Any other questions? We have my dear friend Mary is on, who is
yes.
a Ukrainian expert on everything Ukrainian.
Great.
Oh, Frank, I must interrupt. Not everything Ukrainian. Maybe cooking, maybe music, a little bit of history because of my husband. But there are several things, if I may just add to this very interesting presentation. One of them was about the elderly, so many elderly people left behind. I take a little bit, what's the word I want? It's not that they were left behind, some were, of course, but I have relatives in Ukraine at the moment, many, many relatives. Some of them are elderly. They've had a chance to go to Poland and, immigrate from Ukraine. They refuse to do it. They say, where am I going to go? This is my country. This is where all my friends my age are. At my age, am I going to start over with an unknown future? So some of them think that this would be a very daunting undertaking. Others don't want to go before because of health reasons. They don't think that they, could survive a trip like that. As far as the Russian language in the Donbass, in the eastern part of Ukraine, that has been for a long time historically a heavily Russian populated geographic area.
Right.
During the 1930s, when Stalin imposed the Holodomor, which is the famine by starvation on the Ukrainians, a lot of Ukrainians, died out, areas were decimated, and Stalin took advantage of that fact, and he populated many of those areas with Russians. And as far as why so many people speak Russian, including my very, very patriotic family in Ukraine, was because under the Soviet Union, that was the language, the number one language in schools and whatever. My relatives told me that they were forbidden to speak Ukrainian. Even though they're living in Ukraine, they cannot speak their own language. And tests, everything, exams were in Russian. So when my uncle, whom I hadn't met ever, came to this country, after 49 years after I had left Ukraine, he started speaking with me, and my husband would say to him, "What's happening to your language, Boyko?" He's an older man, and he was throwing in Russian words. Well, that's very understandable. When you're surrounded by a language that's imposed on you, you inevitably pick up words like that. So that's the reason many of them speak Russian. And just like, I'm terribly sorry, I forgot your first name, the presenter. Tim. Just like you said, even though they speak Russian, that doesn't mean that they identify with being Russian.
Right.
And as far as the history of Ukraine, that is something that can be discussed for hours and hours, and the origins of Ukraine and Russia and Kiev and Rus doesn't mean Russia, not necessarily. I just listened to several of Tim Snyder's lectures from Yale, and he touches on this very subject. It's a complicated history. We have things in common, but we are totally, totally different nations. And
Right.
Russia has always wanted to take us over. I mean, how we've survived this long is a miracle. Not just Russia, we've been fought over by the Poles, by the Lithuanians, Austria-Hungary, everybody. It's a fertile land. The people are hardworking, but it's backward because we've been held back for many reasons.
Yeah.
Enough of me. Let somebody else talk.
No. So, what dictates, Tim, you going back?
Well,
A paid assignment? What?
no. I mean, it's also possible to go back funding wise with grants, and I'm looking at putting together. In fact, I've been working on it in my off hours. The Pulitzer Center is pretty good when it comes to funding anywhere from $3,000 to $8,000 for a project, and this is something I've been looking at. Our nurse, Lilia, is one possible project. The only thing is that timing wise, my timing is really poor because I submitted a proposal, 1 page, 800 words, and it was rejected because someone else already did it or has been awarded it. So I'm gonna keep on going. Maybe another subject will be worthy of a grant. The world of photojournalism is very strange compared to what I encountered when I first entered it 25 something years ago. You just had to have a really great story idea written in 2 paragraphs, and you send it to a magazine editor and they say yes or no. These days, you only get no from magazine editors, and you have to either jump on a plane, do it yourself out of your own pocket, funded from other commercial assignments, or you have to turn to funding like the Pulitzer Center. So I think that I'm kind of in this situation where I've resigned myself that I'm never going to get another assignment in Ukraine again, because it's just it's overcovered, and interest is waning. So I'm going to have to get a grant to do it, and how that's going to happen is going to be interesting. I think the Pulitzer Center is one option, but there are others. And so I am itching to go back. I'm not itching to go back and be on the front line. I think that when it comes to Russian artillery, it's suicidal. But being anywhere within 30 kilometers of Russian artillery is just asking for trouble. But I want to go back. The geopolitical significance of what's happening is too difficult to ignore, too hard to ignore.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, I have to say, this was really, it was nice to peel back the onion and get, a human interest story like this, because this woman is clearly heroic in what she's doing in the simplest way, right? I mean, just terrific.
Well, she's still doing it under Russian occupation. And the thing is, again, I would love to be there with her under Russian occupation. It's just impossible for me to do that.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. I don't know, Tim, are you part of that new book that's coming out, Resilient Courage?
No, I don't know.
Yeah,
No one informed me about it, so I don't know. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. I'm just wondering.
What new book?
What's that?
What new book is that?
Yeah. Never mind.
Never mind.
Right. But we just put in the chat room there Tim's website, so you can see all the great work that Tim has done. Tim, I can't thank you enough for being up late at night in England and doing this for us. So you know that I really do appreciate that. and you have a standing invitation, with new work to come back, when you go back, to show us more work, because we'd love to see it. Any thinking of doing video with her? Doing interviews and getting that translated? Maybe that's something.
I'm telling you, the next chance I get to go back, yes, I would love to do that
Okay. Great.
video there. Yeah.
So as everyone knows, we're doing this all week. We have Mad Neeson coming tomorrow, and Wolfgang Schwang, and then Ken Sedeno and Carol Guzzi on Friday. So we have a stellar group of presenters. But Tim, what I'd like to do is for you to get the last word as we do a send-off. So again, thank you, Tim.
No, it was a real pleasure to share, the modest life that this nurse is doing. So, I mean, this is my chance to be a voice for her, and she has no way of communicating to the outside of her little village, and no one knows about her. So she gave me a couple of days, and I'm like, okay, I'm going to show as many people as possible what you're doing, and here we go. And by the way, if you Google CNN, Ukraine, nurse, and my last name, you will find this story. So,
Great.
yeah.
So again, I thank you. And really, Ellen Rosenberg has put it in perspective. It's a story that needs to be told, and you told it, and we're thrilled to have been your audience for the evening. So thank you very, very much.
You're welcome.
And we'll
And thank you.
Yeah.
I'm really glad to talk to, I don't know how many people are on this chat. Hello, everyone.